All right, happy to carry on, Commissioner?
Yes, sir.
Good, thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Commissioner, thank you for coming back to us. Can I just go back to a couple of things that we looked at this morning before we go on with the story? You said a number of times this morning during your evidence when we were discussing training, and specifically training on cladding fires and facade fires, that, well, it wouldn't have mattered, I hope I've got this right, because Mike Dowden wouldn't have been able to extinguish the fire. Have I summarised your evidence fairly?
Yes, you have, correct.
Right. Would it not be right that because Mike Dowden was not trained on the risk of a cladding fire, or he therefore wasn't able to understand how the fire would perform once it had got into the cladding, and therefore how he should respond?
I don't believe so, and I think that's because the nature of the cladding and the way that fire spread meant that the fire had got behind it, and obviously the front face of the cladding is by its very nature rainproof, so that even the understanding of the cladding itself would have meant his response would still have been to try and put water onto the outside of it, which wouldn't be able to penetrate the rainproof cladding. So for me, the issue is that even if he'd had a very detailed, engineered knowledge of cladding, his response to the actual trying to contain the fire would have been the same.
So you're saying this is an unextinguishable fire from the start?
I think from the time it got out of the flat of origin, and bear in mind the firefighters believed they'd extinguished the fire in the flat of origin, and by the time it got into that cladding and behind there, they weren't going to be able to extinguish it.
Was that not critical information or an understanding that Mike Dowden should have had?
Ideally he would have had it, but I genuinely don't believe it would have made a difference on the night to the actions he took, because there was nothing he could have done to prevent that spreading at that point.
But it might have made this difference, Commissioner. It might have meant that, knowing he was now faced with an unextinguishable fire once it had got into the cladding, he should immediately switch to looking for a plan B, such as full or partial evacuation of the building.
But in the context of the cladding fire, bearing in mind, and the examples we've talked about earlier with cladding fires in different countries, there would still have been the expectation that it would not have penetrated into all of the internal compartments, that it would have remained on the outside of the building. And I believe, and obviously I can't know what was in Mike Dowden's mind at that time, but for me, if he had then instantly switched at that point in time to trying to do a full or partial evacuation of Grenfell Tower, what you would have had resulted in was a number of people panicking, trying to get out of a single staircase, and I'm not sure how many people, obviously the people who live in the tower are very familiar with how narrow that staircase was. And the prospect of trying to evacuate those people down with us then trying to get in, because bearing that point, we were still extinguishing the fire on the 4th floor, and while we're then getting fire survival guidance calls telling us that there are people having fire coming into their flats, our imperative at that point is to then get to there and try and extinguish that.
Now, there are two parts of that answer I want just to push a little further on. The first is where you said that, bearing in mind the examples discussed earlier about cladding fires in different countries, there would be the expectation it would not have penetrated into all of the internal compartments. Now, it's not right, is it, that the LFB's expectation of a cladding fire as at June 2014 was that it would not penetrate into compartments?
I believe it was our expectation. It was never our expectation that a fire of that nature would penetrate into every compartment. I don't think that we'd ever considered that, no. Sorry,
let me try this one again. There was no understanding within the LFB that if a cladding structure ignited and fire spread rapidly across it, that nonetheless it would not penetrate into individual compartments.
I'm sorry, it's double negative. So you're saying that we did know that, or we didn't know that?
No, let me try it again.
Sorry.
Let me try it once more. Sitting there, as of June 2014, nobody in the LFB expected that if they were faced with a cladding fire, it wouldn't burst back into apartments.
We didn't anticipate that would happen. No, nobody would reasonably anticipate that that would happen.
Nobody would reasonably anticipate that the occupants of a building, that the facade of which was on fire, would be safe.
Well, obviously, if a building's on fire and the facade's on fire, I can't make the estimate they're safe unless you're there and seeing the premises. And at that point in time, no one had the anticipation of how that fire would spread and wrap around that building and travel into all the compartments.
I think you agree with me that, in fact, as at June 2017, the LFB did not have sufficient learning to be able to be confident, or at least have the expectation that if there was a cladding fire, nonetheless it wouldn't break back into the building?
No, I don't think anyone would have that. I don't think it's just London Fire Brigade.
No. And so it's not. It wouldn't be right to say, would it, that Mike Dowden could reasonably expect that when faced with a cladding fire, he needn't worry because it wouldn't break back into the building?
Not he needn't worry, sorry if that's the impression I gave, that he wouldn't anticipate that would happen if it was burning up the outside of the building. And bearing in mind that from the first images that were seen, it was very clearly burning up straight up there. So I'm not saying that he would be sure it wasn't going to go back in, but I wouldn't anticipate that he'd be thinking automatically that was going to happen.
Well, let me put it slightly differently, but once more. It was not a safe assumption for any firefighter to make, once they'd seen that the fire had got into the cladding, that it wouldn't break back into the building.
No.
No. Now, turning to the second part of that answer, you talked about evacuation. My question is really, but because Mike Dowden did not understand what he was faced with once the fire had got into the cladding, he wasn't even in a position to be able to evaluate a plan B of evacuation.
I think that's probably fair to say because he didn't understand that, but equally I think it's very important to understand that that building is not designed for evacuation. Therefore, going to plan B and thinking about evacuation, that is not something that would naturally happen because we have full understanding that a single staircase building of such a nature with no means of alerting the residents simultaneously is not designed for full or partial evacuation.
No, indeed. But if Mike Dowden or any other watch commander attending at this incident and seeing the fire break into the cladding and move as rapidly as it did, would want at least to know, you would want, as his commissioner or her commissioner, to know that that watch manager at least had a plan B and was able to assess the plan B, whether or not it was a useful plan B.
I think that there probably was plan A, B, C and D because it was such a rapidly evolving dynamic incident. And in fact, I think the actions Mike Dowden took in ordering the number of resources he did in a very short period of time demonstrated that he was making a risk assessment, making a plan, getting sufficient resources there in large numbers to be able to make a plan B.
I'm just going to suggest this to you. The fact that Mike Dowden did not have the training on the risks that cladding like this posed in respect of fire spread over the facade of this high-rise block, the fact that he didn't have that planning, that training, meant that he was not put in a position to work out what to do in place of firefighting.
I think that he did exactly that. I think that he got large numbers of resources there and sufficient numbers to be able to get people into the tower to help to rescue the people in there. So I think he did enact a plan B and I think he did that exceptionally well for an officer of his rank.
And that because he didn't have the sufficient training, or any training on the risks of cladding, he wasn't able to think that he needed to get people out much sooner.
I think he was, and I think that even if you trained people on the risks from cladding, you know, I think that understanding what happened on that night, the dynamic nature of it and the speed with which it happened, it's very difficult to say that if you'd given him training to understand that, it would have meant that he made any different decision.
It may not have done, but it would have at least equipped him to know whether to make a different decision, wouldn't it?
I think that as a very professional fire officer and a very experienced one at that, by actually seeing what was happening, he did do a dynamic risk assessment and made a decision and made a plan. And he did that based on what he saw, which was the most relevant and up-to-date information at that time.
But we know that he didn't set about examining the possibility of evacuation, even at that early stage, once the fire had got into the cladding. What I'm suggesting to you is that had he had training on the unpredictability of fire spread, he would have done, or could have done.
But equally, even if he had training on the cladding itself, what he wouldn't have anticipated were the significant building failures inside the premises that allowed the fire to travel through all the compartments. And his experience and knowledge as a professional fire officer would have told him that trying to evacuate a number of residents in the middle of the night down a single narrow staircase is a very hazardous thing to do. And in fact, we do know that subsequent to Grenfell, that members of the public who have been very understandably alarmed and distressed during high-rise fires have taken some extraordinary steps to evacuate themselves in inappropriate circumstances with no reason to and cause themselves severe harm and life-changing injuries. So his professional knowledge would mean that he would want to make the best judgment call for keeping people safe.
So you're saying, are you, that the fact that Mike Dowden had no training on cladding fires made no difference?
That's my view, yes.
Is that what you want the chairman to conclude, is it?
Yes.
All right. Now, can I go back to the ORD, we discussed plans, and I'm not going to go back over that. Can I just ask you to go back to it, please? It's tab 13 of our documents bundle. And I'll just ask you to look at page 4. Some other aspects of this. At the foot of page 4, under site details, sorry, in the middle of page 4, under site details, we can see water supply, and nothing there about the location of dry rising main outlets within the building. Would you expect to see at least some information about the location of dry rising main outlets within the building on an ORD?
Yes, I would.
So that's a deficiency, is it?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Bottom of the page, fixed installations group, other systems, building facilities, type, smoke extraction systems, description, negative pressure smoke ventilation system in lobby area of fire floor panel located main entrance to building. Slightly side question is, have you ever come across a negative pressure smoke ventilation system in your career?
Not knowingly.
I'm sorry?
Not knowingly.
Not knowingly. Right, so that's effectively a no.
No, I might well have come across one, but I have never been made aware of one.
So you wouldn't know one when you saw one?
No, I wouldn't.
No. Do you think that description of the smoke extraction system, which an arriving watch manager and crew would encounter, was sufficient to enable them to operate it?
Without knowing what the information was on the panel, where it says clearly the panel located at the main entrance of the building, I can't comment on that because it might have been some very clear direction on the panel as to what that meant, which would be sufficient information. We don't want people to write chapter and verse on the ORD because obviously it's something that comes up on the fire engine they can read. And I do see above that it does make mention of the dry rising main as well.
Yes, but not the location as we've established. And then just keeping with the smoke extraction system, would you at least expect to see some kind of direction in the ORD as to how a watch manager such as Mike Dowden would have been able to find instructions as to how to operate the smoke vent system?
No, because I would anticipate they would know that there'd be instruction at the panel located in the main entrance of the building, which is where, when the smoke extraction systems and various other fixed installations, if you go to the point where the panel is, that's where the instructions will be.
Right, so you're saying, so I understand it, that this indicates to any watch manager reading this on the way to an incident that instructions will be on the panel? I
would assume that's where they'd go. If I read that as a watch manager on a fire engine, I would go to the panel.
Right. Now, if the panel didn't have instructions on it, would that make this then a deficient entry?
It would make it not entirely useful. It wouldn't be deficient because you'd know there was a system, but it wouldn't make it the most detailed information. So but I would anticipate that if there wasn't instructions, then there was a fault with the building.
Looking at on-site action, you can see at the bottom of the page some emergency contacts. Would you expect those emergency contacts to be kept up to date at all times?
No, I wouldn't. It's very difficult. Building owners change, responsible people change. The information is very much like an MOT, only good at the moment you put it on there. We regularly get people change, and sometimes it's very difficult to get the name and contact number of a responsible person.
Right. Would you expect, so that this ORD is useful, that the building owner would do their best to ensure that information was kept up to date?
You would hope they would, but what we generally would do in events like this, where we know it's a local authority-owned building, is at a very early stage request the tenants of the LALO, who will then provide us with that information. Right.
Would you expect the local station responsible for this ORD entry to keep on at the local authority to make sure that these details were up to date?
No, I wouldn't.
Why is that?
Because of the sheer volume and number of buildings and ORD entries on their ground, they simply haven't got the capacity to do that.
But let me just see if I can understand this better. Is it not essential information that the emergency contact information is kept up to date?
It's useful information. I wouldn't say it's essential on the grounds of the fact that even when we have got contact information, it doesn't mean the person will answer the telephone or we can get hold of them at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is quite often what happens. Even when you have got up-to-date information, people don't answer their telephones or they only work business hours. So it's far more useful for us to call the on-duty, on-call LALO to come to the scene.
Right, so you don't think that it's important that the emergency contact information is kept up to speed?
It's useful but not critical.
It's useful but not critical. Right. And what if, as we see, these people actually were not part of the local authority at all? They were building contractors, representatives.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well, if those people identified there under that entry were not actually local authority people at all, that would make the emergency contacts entry positively misleading in one sense, because those people were not available at all.
It would depend what information you wanted from them, to be fair. So the contact information of a receptionist, I'm not quite sure what useful information we'd be able to glean from her. So it would depend the nature of the information that you wanted from the emergency contact.
Yes, and nobody would know that until they were on their way.
No, you wouldn't know that, but to be, in my experience, considerable experience to be fair, every single incident where you wanted support and information, it's the lay low you need, predominantly because what you mainly want is to have somewhere where you can set up a rest centre for displaced residents from a building.
And you would also want to know, wouldn't you, on the ORD, that the building had a functioning firefighter lift?
The ORD wouldn't be of any use to that whatsoever. That's, again, only good as an MOT. The fire lift could be functioning one day, and as we quite regularly find with a lot of fixed installations, they either break or are tampered with or become defective through various reasons. So saying it was on the ORD wouldn't be any use to us whatsoever.
Right. Can I then go to your first view of the fire? Now, you arrived, I think, at the scene at just before 2:51, and you took a photograph, and we have that at MET 000-15760.
We're going to give a warning.
I was. Perhaps I should just give another warning, and I'll wait 30 seconds or so. This is a photograph, for those who've joined since the break, of the building on fire at 2:51. There may be people who find it distressing, and so I would just, I think, say that if you do, then either leave the room now, if you're in here or in the streaming room, or avert your gaze. There's no soundtrack that accompanies this at all. So perhaps I shall leave it 30 seconds or so, Mr. Chairman.
Well, a short pause to see if anyone wants to move.
Yeah. Now, let's have that up. It's MET 000-15760. First of all, Commissioner, where was this taken from? Do you remember?
From the location where I parked my car. I'll just look at my notes to remind me where it was. So it was actually taken from me standing at the back of my car while I was getting rigged in my operational uniform. So that's on the map I make reference to. I just temporarily can't remember the name of the road.
Right. Do you know which orientation this was taken from? Was it which side of the tower?
That is the southeast. It's the side looking from the leisure centre where the trees were.
So that's probably is that the north side or the east side? It's difficult.
East, I think.
On that answer.
East at that point.
Well, the leisure centre is to the north, the northeast, and the trees are on the east.
Yeah, so it's the side that is the east where the trees were.
Right. So, what did this view tell you at the moment you took the photograph about this fire?
That we had a spectacular, complete failure of a building where all floors were alight. My first thought genuinely was this is like nothing I've ever seen. It looked like something from a film where somebody set it up like Towering Inferno or something like that. And my first thought was this can never happen to a building in England. But it did tell me that, bearing in mind the knowledge I then had of listening to the fire survival guidance calls and looking at the building as it was there, that there was going to be significant loss of life that night.
And at that moment, what were your thoughts, initial thoughts, on what strategy should be adopted to save life?
So my initial thoughts were I needed to get to meet the OIC and to have a conversation about what actions and what plans were taking place. I think looking at a building like that, what you need to understand is that there is no strategy in place that is going to resolve that fire. So I was not at any point thinking that we were going to be able to extinguish the fire, bearing in mind that from a dry rising main, at best you can supply 2, maybe 3 firefighting jets. Understanding the number and level of floors that were on fire at that point, extinguishing the fire was not an option, and it was how best we were going to be able to try and make efforts to get into the building to rescue as many people as possible.
Right. Now, is it fair to say that at that stage, on arrival, you had already decided not to take on the incident command role?
No, not at all. I was never going to make that decision until I'd had a conversation with the incident commander, and I was assured that he was undertaking his role and that he wasn't overwhelmed by it. So you make that assessment once you've gone and done your initial risk assessment, had the conversation, and are assured of the operational plan.
So the first thing you did, is this right, was to go to find the incident commander?
I did, yes.
Did you know who that was?
No, I didn't.
How did you find that out?
I went to the command unit. So I went from there, to be fair, that is it Clarendon Road I'm in? Let's come back to me. It's on a bend, basically parked outside something called Safe Store or Shore Store or something. So I made my way from there. It was a considerable distance, reasonably away. What you can't see is in front of the white van is a fire appliance parked, which is blocking the road, which is why I chose to stop there, so I couldn't actually proceed any further towards the incident. So I got out of my car, I got myself rigged in my operational uniform, and I then ran. And for those who understand firefighting, we never run on the fire ground because running can cause panic and distress to people. I figured that wasn't going to make any odds on the night, and I wanted to get there as soon as possible. It was quite a complicated route I chose to get, or had to find myself to get around there because it was through a housing estate. I went down a road called Verity Close, which I landmarked because I realised I'd have to at some point come back and find my car. I then made my way. I found myself standing with the leisure centre at my back. I took stock of the tower for maybe 10 seconds to get myself a full understanding of the situation. I then went down towards the side where I encountered one of my command unit staff in a red checkered tabard. I'm not sure who it was, and I asked him where the command unit was. He then asked me if I wanted to go to the Fire Survival Guidance Command Unit or the Incident Command one, and I said the Incident Command because I wanted to find out who the Incident Commander was.
Right. Thank you. Now, you say on page 10 of your statement, in the third paragraph there, I then saw Assistant Commissioner Andy Rowe and understood that he had assumed the role of Incident Commander. Yeah. That's on the CU, is it?
Yes.
CU8?
Yes.
Okay. And then you say, in the next paragraph, the last paragraph on that page, first line, you say, I know Andy very well as I know all my officers very well. We had a relatively short conversation then. And you go on to say, you said it was a two-way conversation. And he said, I'll give you a brief update and a fuller update afterwards. See that. And then he gave you a brief update, I think. And you summarised that at the foot of page 10. He then said, we've got the 40 pumps there here, we've got multiple survival guidance calls, we're fully committed in BA into the tower, making best endeavours to reach as many people. I'm about to get an update from all the sectors as to where we are with what's going on. And I said, OK, is there anything you want me to do while I'm out? And he said, just tell me what you see. Now, that's a version of your recollection you gave to the police when you did your statement. Is that as best you remember it now?
No, now from the footage you showed Andy Rowe yesterday, I know that's not it was my memory, but that's not in the right order.
Oh, right. Could you then reorder it for us?
So I now have reason to believe that I got to the command unit. I know I checked in and I gave him my nominal roll board, at which point I believe Andy must have been leaving to go to the tower because we went to the tower together. You showed footage yesterday of us being in the base of the tower at about 3:01. So that's a very short time order from me putting my fire gear on, running to the command unit, doing the thing, and Andy and I getting back into the tower. So I believe we had the conversation initially as a walking brief together, walking to the tower, and we both went into the tower together. I
follow. Now, let's just focus on the briefing. Am I right in thinking that that briefing that you've described in your statement is still correct in your recollection?
As a walking brief, yes, rather than on the command unit.
OK. Now, just summarising it, were you given any details by Andy Rowe as to the number of FSG calls?
No, not at that time.
Were you given any details of his tactical plan?
Not at that time.
Did you discuss stay put?
We did discuss stay put very early on. So he told me that stay put had been revoked, but I'm not sure the timing of that, but it was very early on in our encounter. OK, he told you it had been revoked. Did he tell you when he'd revoked it? No, he just said he had.
Sorry, I should have asked you who revoked it. He told you he had?
He told me he had, and he didn't give me a time frame, as I remember.
Right. Did he tell you, or did you get the impression that it was the first thing he did when he arrived?
Yes, because I also knew that he had not been there that much time before me.
Right.
He did say he hadn't been there long.
Did he tell you that he'd in fact decided, at least contingently decided, that he was likely to do so, to revoke the stay put, even before he arrived?
No, he didn't.
Did you ask him why the advice to residents had not been changed earlier?
No, I didn't.
Why is that?
Because at that moment in time it was far more important to collect the information with the ongoing situation to rescue as many people. We have plenty of time after incidents to do debriefs and discuss orders and plans. The priority at that point was to save life.
Right. Was it not important for you to get a full overview as to what had been happening on the incident ground, even from the start, at least an outline?
That was why I went with Andy to the tower with the ORT officers, so we could walk and talk. I could understand what had happened to that point, and what was happening was the forward plan, which was the most critical thing at that moment in time, was understanding there was a building fully involved in fire with a number of people still trapped in there, and my priority, as remained throughout the night, was to rescue people.
Yes. Just going back to my point, was it not important for you to establish why it was Andy Rowe who revoked stay put when he arrived only a few minutes before he did so, rather than finding out why it hadn't been revoked earlier in the night?
No, not in the slightest at that moment in time. It would have been no benefit to me whatsoever to understand historical information. My priority was the future.
The reason I ask that is because in order to be able to carry out your evaluation of the operations on the ground as monitoring officer, would you not want to know, at least an outline, how the fire had developed from the start?
Yes, I was very clear I want to know that, but the information about decisions that have been made historically is something we explore fully in the performance review of command, and that we can have as a debrief afterwards. Knowing that information would have been no benefit to me whatsoever.
Were you not keen to find out at what point compartmentation had failed on a mass basis, as you could now see?
No, not at that moment in time. I really need to impress at that moment in time I have a building fully involved in fire with a large number of people in there. I have a large number of my firefighters that I'm putting in to a critical environment, and all I want to do is get as many of them in there to rescue the people as possible. The whys and wherefores of decisions that have been made previously can come at a later date. At that moment in time you have to understand the pressing priority is to save life, and that's what we were doing.
No, I understand that. I'm just seeking to explore with you to what extent you as monitoring officer, with an obligation in that role to evaluate the incident commander's plan, asked him why it was left to him so late to revoke stay put, and why it hadn't been done earlier.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Miller, it is no interest to me at that moment in time. The monitoring officer role also states that the information is fed into the PLC for review afterwards. That's absolutely critical information for a PLC. In order for us to enact our operational plan and save lives, wasting time talking about a time a decision was made is of no benefit to me at that moment in time.
Well, at that moment in time, but do you even know today why the incident commander, all the incident commanders prior to Andy Rowe, had not changed that advice for the almost 2 hours or so following the outbreak of the fire?
Of course I know now, it's something we explored at the PLC.
What's the answer?
Because they're very clear in the fact that it was a single staircase. In fact, there was no means of contacting the people inside all of those flats. A lot of the people were trapped by the nature of the smoke, so the actual communal stairs and areas were not safe to evacuate people into, and they were making best endeavours to rescue the people who were trapped in the fire. Bringing people out of that moment in time who were not involved in fire or smoke would have added to the congestion on the stairs, would have increased the number of casualties, and would have delayed the response of my firefighters getting into the tower.
Just look at that from a slightly different angle. I think you accepted this morning that the stay put advice proceeds on the assumption that there would not be a whole block fire or mass breach of compartmentation. Yes?
Of course, yes.
Yes. And would that mean that once there was a whole building fire or mass breach of compartmentation, then stay put was no longer viable?
Clearly, yes.
Yes. And therefore, is it not, or was it not essential for you at some stage to know when that point was?
During the PLC, absolutely.
Yes. And when was that?
You gave me the date. I think it was about 10 days after.
No, not the PLC. The moment in the night when stay put became untenable because there was mass breach of compartmentation throughout the building.
I don't know. It was some considerable time before I got there, so I'm not sure what time that took place.
You don't know?
Not the specific timing, no.
You say it was some considerable time before you got there. Does that mean that it was
half an hour?
Right. What I'm seeking to do, really, is to work out why it was left so long to revoke stay put. That's what I'm trying to do.
Absolutely, and I understand that is the real tenet of this, but for me to speculate on what the incident commander at the scene could see at the time, what the information they had and the actions they were taking would be improper. We have had a review of that conversation, and I've been part of that very clearly. But for me, they've been absolutely very adamant and clear that those people who were in flats that were unaffected by smoke and heat were safer at that moment in time to stay where they were, because to bring them out into an environment where we know it was untenable on the stairs because the people in fire survival guidance were telling us they could not leave their property safely, at that moment in time, all we would have done then is bring people who were in an apparent place of safety into a place of danger and potentially kill them. That's why they made that decision at that time. Also with the full knowledge that it's a very narrow staircase, which now has numerous numbers of firefighters in breathing apparatus with hose going up the stairs, and bringing additional people down into that space would not have been a benefit for us to go and rescue the people who were most at need, who were having fire survival guidance.
And really what I'm seeking to find out from you is, even after the meetings we had after the fire, to the best of your knowledge, at what point in the night did stay put as advice become untenable because of mass breach of compartmentation?
I don't know the exact time, I'm sorry.
Right. Is it not something that you, as Commissioner, need to know?
No, what I need to know is the fact that my officers were making decisions based on the information they had at the time on the fire ground and the fire survival guidance calls coming in, and they were the best placed ones to make those decisions. It's not to me to speculate the information they had and the decisions they made at that time.
No.
They were based on sound information and what they had in front of them.
No, but would you accept that it would be for you to work out and then tell us why it was that stay put wasn't revoked until it was?
I think I've just explained that, but I'm happy to go through it again if you like, about why it wasn't revoked.
No, it's okay. I think I've understood that answer. Maybe put it a different way. Would it not be your role to work out more precisely in the night at what point the stay put became untenable on the basis of what was known to those on the scene?
No, because I think they made the decision based on what they knew at that moment in time.
Did you discuss with Andy Rowe his plans for the evacuation of the tower on this walk to the tower?
We discussed his plans for rescuing the people who were trapped and under fire survival guidance, yes.
And what were those plans?
Those plans were, he gave me the information about how the information was coming into the fire survival guidance unit, how that was being relayed to the tower, to the Bridgehead, and that crews were being briefed on that information to go up and rescue residents.
Can I ask you to then turn to page 10 of your statement and look at the fourth paragraph, 6 lines down. Oh, sorry, 6 lines up from the bottom of the page. And you've seen that. And then I'd go on, if you would, to page 11. At the top, you say you describe the role of monitoring officer there. And you say in the 4th line, I concluded it was pointless me sitting on his shoulder for a TCG meeting, listening to him and the other agencies talking about everything. It's far more useful if I go out to the fire ground to make an assessment of what he thinks is happening, and then I can double-check that for him. I think the reality is that, as you say, in order to fulfil your role as monitoring officer, you had to find out for yourself what was happening on the fire ground.
Absolutely.
Is that a fair description of your
Definitely.
report? And then you say, as you do at page 11 in the first main paragraph, at the end of where we've just been looking, I left. It was very important because of the significance of the event that I went and looked at the building and went into the building and spoke to people so that I got a really good situational understanding of what was happening. That's right, is it?
It is, yes.
Now, it's also right, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Andy Rowe said to you, go and look.
No, that's probably not correct now, knowing what I know, because we went together.
Right.
So later on, he did ask me to do that while he was conducting the TCG, slightly later in the morning,
Right.
3:39 maybe.
Okay. So you're both off the CU at this point.
Indeed.
Before you left the CU together, do you recall a call coming through from control that was taken by Borough Commander West that expressly sought your advice to change the stay put?
No.
You don't?
No.
Okay. Now, you go out onto the incident ground, as you say, in order to get a, quotes, really good situational understanding of what was happening. And then I think you go into the tower. Mm-hmm. Now, I think in your statement, same page, page 11, in the second last paragraph, you estimate that you went into the tower probably at about 3:12 to 3:15. I think you were about to tell us earlier on just this afternoon that's not quite right.
No, that's not right now. I know from the picture you showed Andy yesterday that it was considerably earlier than that. Yeah,
well, let's just get that picture up. It's INQ quintuple 0392. This is the picture at 0302, which we looked at yesterday. Andy identified himself because he was the one with his arms outstretched. Can you identify yourself on that picture? Yes,
I'm there, standing facing the picture.
Right. Now, in your statement, you say that at that stage, and this is page 13, in the third paragraph, you say, at that time, so we can take the picture down, at that time, I understood the breathing apparatus entry control point was located at the Bridgehead on the 4th floor. Mm-hmm. I also knew that the two officers in command at the Bridgehead were Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welch. Mm-hmm. Did you talk to them at that point?
No, they were on the 4th floor, I was on the ground floor.
Now, who told you that they were at the 4th floor?
I believe it was either Matt Cook or Mick Mulholland.
Right. In fact, we've established during this inquiry that the Bridgehead was on the 3rd floor at this time and about to come down to the ground floor. Did you know that at the time? Presumably not.
No. I think that happened not long after I left the tower, to be fair. But
are you sure in your mind that Mick Mulholland and Matt Cook told you that the Bridgehead was at the 4th floor?
No, that's what I recollected at the time, but they could well have said the 3rd floor. And I'm just, if you 2 seconds to indulge my thing, my memory of the night, my recollection of the night, as a number of other people, some of the events are not recollected in the right order. I have some very large memory gaps, which I have reason to believe is due to the trauma of the night. I have been having counselling for it, for the PTSD I have, but I have large chunks of memory that are still missing and things that are out of time. I've tried to do my best to make a recollection of what I know, but I think that the severe trauma for me of the responsibility of that night, the personal stress and pressure that caused me, has caused my memory to be not as I would wish it to be able to recall facts in a clear order.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll do our best and see where we get to. Yeah. In your statement at page 13, which we're on, if you look at this last paragraph, you say, I deliberately did not go to the 4th floor at that moment. Now, can we substitute 4th floor for 3rd floor, or 3rd floor for 4th floor? Do you mean the Bridgehead?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Because I'd only gone to get a small situational awareness to then return back to Andy and do a briefing with him. Yeah. It looks from that as if you'd separated from Andy, but I think you're now telling us, and looking at the picture, you were with Andy all the time during this visit. Is that right?
Indeed, yes. I genuinely had no recollection of Andy being there when I went into the tower until I saw that photograph.
Right.
That to me, that was a bit of a complete shock yesterday, the fact that Andy and I went there, and it just goes to show the level of trauma and the impact that has on the night, because I remember being in there with Matt Cook and Mick Mulholland, but the fact that Andy and I went there together, in fact, the speed with which I was in the tower, I'm very pleased I went there that quickly to get the awareness, but it was quite a surprise to me yesterday.
Yes. When you say, and this may be your recollection playing tricks with you, which I understand, but you say you wanted to get a small situational awareness to then return back to Andy and do a briefing with him. Given that you were with him, as it's now turned out, when were you going to do the full briefing with him?
So obviously, in my mind, I think I'm going to get a situational awareness and go back to the command unit. In fact, I think what we obviously did at that time was we went together so that Andy could brief me as we went. He obviously also wanted to get some further situational awareness, and we then went back to the command unit where he then briefed me on the structure using the information on the command unit.
Okay. Given your responsibilities as monitoring officer and the need for you to gain what you described here as a situational awareness, or earlier on as a really good situational awareness, situational understanding, that's page 11. Given your need to do that, was there not a need, and possibly a compelling need, to go directly to the Bridgehead and get first-hand information, even if not in detail, but a first-hand impression from the Bridgehead commanders themselves as to the present state of the conditions in the building?
No, because I was able to ascertain that from Matt Cook and Mick Mulholland, who were with me, who were the RRT officers.
Right, what did they tell you?
They told me that the fire survival guidance calls were being responded to. I think at that point they were under the impression that we would have to move the bridgehead at some point because there was smoke was coming down into the stairwell. At that point we were committing as many crews as we could up into the tower, but the circumstances were exceedingly challenging. We'd had issues with burst hose and water supplies, obviously. They also informed me at that time that we were committing firefighting crews without water, which is completely contrary to everything as a professional officer we would ever do because of the risk to firefighters, and they gave me that briefing while we were in the base of the tower. So at that moment in time I didn't feel the need to go to the 4th floor to have the conversation.
Did you ask either of those officers, Matt Cook or Mick Mulholland, whether deployments in response to specific FSG calls were successful or not?
No.
Is there a reason why not?
Because at that point that level of detail was not of use to me, because I had been given the understanding that although that people were going to specific flats to search them, that when they got there sometimes the people weren't in there and had moved, and the level of detail of knowing which numbers and flats was not going to help me with understanding what I needed to do at that moment in time.
Now, maybe early on, and maybe this is an early question, but did you understand at that stage what Andy Rowe's primary objectives were?
Absolutely.
Which were what?
Save life.
By doing what?
By committing as many breathing apparatus crews into the tower as we physically could.
Maximising rescues?
Indeed.
Right. Didn't you need then a full briefing from, if not the Bridgehead commanders, then Mick Mulholland and Matt Cook, so that you could brief yourself and grasp for yourself the challenges that the Bridgehead faced, and then apply your experience and leadership in your monitoring officer role to assess what Andy Rowe was planning?
I didn't need any detailed briefing to understand the challenges. Standing in the base of the tower, speaking to firefighters, speaking to Matt and Mick, seeing the situation and understand the fire survival guidance calls, I didn't need more detail than that to understand that we were up against an impossible situation with a fully developed fire inside several flats with people trapped in there. Detailed knowledge of numbers and where people are going would not have helped in my mind. Andy's plan was absolutely right and proper, that we were committing people, as many as we could, into the tower to respond to the fire survival guidance calls.
Did you get a grasp at that time of what kind of order or priority crews were being dispatched to what floors in order to respond to what calls?
No, I just knew that the information was coming into the tower, going up to the bridgehead and being used by the people at the bridgehead to dispatch crews.
Did you make any inquiries at that stage to establish the conditions in the stairwell?
Yes, I did, and which is why I've been given the information that they might have to move the bridgehead down because the smoke was starting to penetrate to lower floors. Right.
Did you find out what the conditions were like in the stairwell higher up the building?
From a very brief conversation with Matt and Mick from the crews, they said that the conditions are exceedingly difficult in the stairwells. There are some areas that are very hot and very smoky.
And did you make any inquiries as to what the conditions were like in the lobbies?
No, so they said they called them the communal parts, to be fair, which is stairwells and lobbies, so I understood it to be completely impacting. Did
you make any inquiries as to the measures that could be implemented to improve conditions in the common parts, as you put it?
Sadly, I don't think there were any conditions that could have improved that on the grounds of the fact we didn't have firefighting media to be able to take to those floors. We couldn't extinguish the fire, therefore improving any conditions in there was virtually impossible. Did
you ask whether there was a ventilation or smoke extraction system within the building?
No, I didn't. I think the conversation came up later on.
Right.
But at that moment in time, with all the compartments breached, no smoke extraction system in the world was ever going to compete with that.
Did you consider the deployment of some kind of tactical ventilation?
We had a conversation around tactical ventilation, but the risks around tactical ventilation and putting a fan in is that it also pushes the products from combustion throughout the building, and we had absolutely no way of identifying whether or not that was feasible, possible, would it worsen situations for different people. So we had a conversation, but it wasn't something we enacted.
Was that the conversation? Did you have that conversation at this stage or later?
No, I think it must have been later.
Right, we may come back to that. And while you were in the tower, did you seek to establish whether there was a systematic search and rescue system in process, so as you might be able to avoid repeat deployments of BA crews?
No, and to be fair, what I knew that the two officers who were at the Bridgehead, so Pat Goldborn and Richard Welsh, are both very experienced officers, and I would be very happy that they were enacting the most suitable plan to respond to the fast fire guidance calls using the firefighting resources we had.
And at that point, so this is your trip to the tower about 3:01. Did you ask Matt or Mick, if I can call them that, or Andy Rowe, how high up in the tower crews were reaching at that point?
Yes, every time I went to the tower and every conversation I had, I asked that. What I can't recall at the moment is what floor they told me at that time.
And then, can you remember how long you stayed in the tower at that time before you went back to the command unit?
Minutes, 3-4 minutes maybe. It was just enough to have an understanding, and as much as anything to present myself to the firefighters so they understood I was on the fire ground there supporting them.
Right. Mr. Chairman, we've had 45 minutes and I've been told that that's an appropriate length of time.
Yes.
Shall we have a short break?
Yes, we could have a short break. You might welcome that, I don't know. But we'll do that and we'll come back at 3 o'clock, please. So no talking again about your evidence, if you don't mind. And
thanks, sir.
You can go to the usher.
Thank you.
Right, 3 o'clock then, please. All right, ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Good, thank you. Yes, just a minute.
Commissioner, thank you for coming back to us. Can I then just finish off your first trip to the Tower and then pursue your path, as it were, from there? Did you gain, on your first visit to the Tower, any situational awareness of the system of communication of fire survival guidance information within the Tower and to the Bridgehead?
No, not at that time.
Right. Then you left the Tower and I think went back to CU 8.
Yes.
Did you go to CU 7?
No, I didn't at that time.
Why did you not go to CU 7, do you think?
Because I wanted to get a fuller briefing from Andy as to the structures he had in place and the officers he had doing various roles, and we needed to go back to CU 7 to do that.
Right.
Did
you go to CU? Sorry, I'm so sorry. Do you want
Sorry,
to
no,
finish your answer?
we're back to the main command unit, not the FSG unit. Let's get them on. So I needed to go back to the main command unit with Andy to be able to understand the structure and to look at the officers he had in position.
Right. Did you later go to CU 7?
I did briefly and put my head around the door.
Right. Do you remember roughly even when that was?
I'm terribly sorry, I don't.
All right. Okay, we'll explore that. You go back to CU 7, and at page 15 of your statement, you say you got back there at 3:35. If you just turn to that, it's the second last paragraph. You say, I think I got back to CU 8 at 3:35. Now, I just wonder whether that's correct in the light of the photograph we've seen and the timings we've established this afternoon.
I believe it is because Andy Rowe, I think, then went back to the CU to have the tactical coordination group meeting that we had discussed. And at that time, I made a number of phone calls while standing on the corner of Bowmore Road.
Did you catch the end of the TCM, the tactical coordination meeting that was in place?
No, I think it had just finished and people leaving the command unit as I arrived back.
Right. Is that where you got the 3:35 from?
I think so. I think it was from the, as we're lovingly calling the row log.
All right. Well, let's just very briefly look at that. I don't want to take up time on it, but just to be clear, so we're all clear. If you go to that, which is MET quadruple 5405, we can see that the tactical coordination meeting number 1, which is 3:20, halfway down that page, AC Rowe introduces himself and chairs briefing. Where were you at 3:20 when that started?
Outside making phone calls.
You were outside making phone
Indeed.
calls. I see. Okay. So you come back from the Tower, he'd gone in and you were outside making phone calls?
Yes, I was.
How long were you outside making phone calls for?
I would estimate probably maybe, so 15 minutes. It wasn't entirely making phone calls. I did speak to some members of the public while I was outside.
Right. So okay. And then at 3:39 we see sit rep, which we worked out yesterday was situation report. Yeah,
yes.
with Matt Cook,
Yeah.
just before halfway down the page.
Indeed.
Were you there for that?
I was, yes.
Right. So you got onto the CU at some point before 3:39.
Indeed.
Now, at page 17 of your statement, if we can go back to that, please, you say in the second paragraph that you had a conversation with Andy, and you say, Andy relayed to me the information he had, and we had a discussion around the tactical plan. Now, I've asked you about that at this point in your statement because it's 2 pages after the 3:35 time mark. But tell me, is that conversation the one that happened at that time?
I believe so.
Okay. And you go on to say, we had a discussion around the tactical plan. I asked him what the command structure was, who was reporting into who, which officers were in which situation. He explained all of that to me and further explained who was in charge of each sector, who the safety officers were, and what their briefings were. And then you go on to say, it gave me the opportunity to ask him questions and also to be able to identify if there were any areas or problems that I needed to highlight with him. I've read that all to you because I have a number of questions about much of it. First of all, was this what you would call the proper briefing, the full briefing with Andy Rowe?
I believe so.
How long did that discussion take, do you think?
Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe not that long. It was as much information we needed to share at that time and not to interrupt the flow of what was taking place.
Right. Now, you say you had a discussion around the tactical plan. You can see that in the first and second lines there. What did you understand the plan to be once you discussed it with him?
So I understood the plan was that we were committing as many resources into the tower in response to the fire survival guidance calls. They were being deployed through the Bridgehead where Richard Welsh and Pat Goulburn were, and that on leaving the tower the firefighters were having a debrief and the information was being recorded. I knew at that point that we were unable to record the information on the forward information boards, and the information was being written onto the walls of the tower inside. I understood that the priority was to commit as many crews as possible. We had a conversation around EDBA and the requirements because of the travel distance to use EDBA for the higher floors, but that there were issues with the heat barriers and smoke in some of the areas, and that we were unable to contain the fires or extinguish them, but we were trying to make best endeavours to do so, to not only protect the access for firefighters, but the egress for firefighters and residents.
At that stage, did you discuss, or did you gain any understanding of the methods being adopted to brief crews at the Bridgehead?
No.
Did you gain any understanding about the system of deployment of crews at the Bridgehead at that time?
Only that the information was being brought from the Fire Survival Guidance Unit to the Bridgehead, and Pat Goulburn and Richard Welsh were in charge of that deployment.
Did you understand or perhaps assume that Richard Welsh and Pat Goulburn at the Bridgehead were acting on the fire survival guidance information being brought to them?
At that time I did.
You did? At the time you did. Did that change later?
Later I went and verified for myself because I went back into the tower, into the base of the tower, and I could see what was happening firsthand. Right,
we'll come to that. I'll just park that then for the moment. Can I just then take you to page 34 of your statement and ask you to look at something there. This is the second from bottom paragraph. And it's under the heading, it's not that easy to see because it hasn't got underlining, the building and factors that impeded our firefighting and rescue efforts. That's nearer the top of the page, but that's there. Just at the end of the second last paragraph, you say, we were never going to get jets onto the floors to fight it. It was an impossible task because there was no way of dealing with it. Now, that view, was that a view that you formed? Well, let me ask it this way. When did you form that view during the night?
The moment I got out of my car.
Right, so you thought this was an unfightable fire from the start of your involvement on the fire ground?
I knew it was.
You knew it was? Right.
I did.
What were you briefed by anybody regarding stay put?
Only that the stay put advice had been revoked, which Andy Rowe told me.
Right. As your in your role as monitoring officer, what was your view of the decision to withdraw the stay put advice?
My view was it was maybe the best information at the time, and that's what we were acting on.
Right. Did you ask who made the decision?
Andy Rowe told me he had.
Right. So, I'm sorry to go back over this, but it goes back to the briefings. Do you remember observing or receiving a telephone call from control room about the question of withdrawing the stay put advice?
No, not at all.
Right. Do you know, or did you know, on the night whether Andy Rowe had been asked for permission from control to change the stay put advice?
No.
Did you know on the night that control had in fact decided themselves to change the stay put advice?
No, I didn't.
When did you discover that? Or did you ever discover it?
I did discover it. I definitely knew it at the PRC and probably potentially in a conversation in the days following, but not on the night.
Right. During this briefing, or this is the second briefing once you're back on the CU, or during the mobile briefing you had, a shorter one with Andy Rowe, during either of those, did you discuss any plan by him as to how to go about effecting an evacuation?
No, we didn't talk about it in terms of evacuation. We talked about it in terms of rescue, because that's what it was. It wasn't an evacuation. Evacuation implies an orderly process where you're going to be able to contact people and ask them to leave. Right. What we were in was very heavily a rescue phase for people who were trapped in a burning building.
Right. When was the first time you were told that the single stairwell was the only escape route?
Very early on, I think, walking to the tower with Andy, I was made aware of that.
What was your impression of that? What impact did that have on you?
That it was going to be a very difficult task to be able to not only get firefighting crews up there in numbers, but to be able to bring residents out of the tower. And I also knew at that point that by the time you add hose lines into that, and so, you know, when firefighters are wearing fire gear and breathing apparatus, they take up a bit more space. So I knew from that point a very small staircase was going to provide a huge challenge for us.
Did you discuss the difficulties posed by smoke congestion, obstacles and two-way person flow?
Yes, very early on.
Very early on. And what strategy or plan did you form in your head as a result of knowing those facts?
We were going to do our very best endeavours to be able to commit people up there at the same time as bringing people out. There is no way of having one-way traffic or an orderly process in that, because, you know, you've got teams of firefighters going up, then meeting a team of firefighters, bringing 3 or 4 people down with them. So it's a case of making, you know, the priorities to bring the people we've rescued out, but at the same time the priority is to commit more firefighters in there to conduct further rescues.
What equipment was available to the brigade to assist residents to get down the staircase as part of that rescue plan?
I'm sorry, equipment? I
Yes.
don't think there is any equipment apart from firefighters.
Let me ask the question, focusing on second set breathing apparatus. Did it occur to you to think of using, even improvising, second set breathing apparatus to assist occupants of the building to come down?
No, the second set breathing apparatus are provided for firefighters for use in rescuing when firefighters are trapped. It's an extremely heavy piece of equipment, very cumbersome, and we only carry a very limited supply of them. Therefore, there was no way it was feasible, knowing the numbers of people in there, to even think about trying to take those up and effect rescues with them. In addition to which, carrying any additional equipment into the tower was so physically demanding for the firefighters, who were already walking up numerous flights of stairs in extreme heat, wearing firefighting equipment. I wouldn't have sought to do anything that would slow them down. Equally, trying to persuade people to put face masks on, members of the public, is extremely difficult. Our best bet was to get to them and get them out quickly.
And how would you get them out? How would you bring them through a smoke-logged staircase?
As quickly as possible is the only way of doing it. There is no suitable way. Trying to keep them low, advise them to have wet towels and things around their face, but actually the best bet at that moment in time is for us to be able to actually physically encourage them to go very fast and move them out.
Right. So I think is the answer to my question, there was no equipment available to the brigade to assist with their respiration or movement?
No, there isn't.
We've covered second set BAs. One more question on that. Were you made aware on the night of the fact that at least one rescue had been made of residents in the building with a second set BA?
No, I wasn't aware of that until, I think, potentially the next day.
I see. What did you think of that when you learnt it?
It's grateful another life saved, to be fair.
Now, we talked about plans this morning. Did you yourself ask to see any plans of the tower so as to be able better to understand the strategy and any structural difficulties that might have emerged?
No, Andy and I had a conversation around plans, and he made me aware there weren't any plans, so there was no value in me asking to see them.
You discussed plans together,
We did
you?
indeed.
And can you describe, what your view was about not having them?
It was very unhelpful.
Right. Right. I think you approved tactical ventilation to be brought to the fireground at some stage, didn't you?
I did.
Is that PPV?
It is, yes.
If we go to the row log, I think we can see that that was at an early stage. I'll just try and get that for you. And this may have been at the time you arrived. Could you go, please, to page 1 of the row log? You can see that at 02:57, PPV positive pressure ventilation requested by duty DAC. Were you on the CU8 by that time, do you think?
I might have been briefly, but that request by the duty DAC was remote from the fireground, so
Right.
that would have been at the control centre where Adrian Fenton was.
Right. Did you know about that request when you got onto the CU?
No, I was not aware of that.
You didn't. When did you first become aware that a tactical ventilation system had been sought?
When somebody, and in fact it was a time when Andy was off the command unit, and somebody spoke to me about wanting to get ventilation there and asked for my permission to order it, so I made that decision whatever time that's recorded as part of the row log. That was the first time a conversation was had around tactical ventilation. To be fair, at that moment in time, I'm happy to get resources mobilised and come into the incident. I did not anticipate it was going to be able to be used.
Right. And just looking ahead, did you get resources there?
I believe the PPV came, but we couldn't use it.
You didn't use it?
We were unable to use it, not that we didn't.
Okay, I was going to ask you, was it tried?
We couldn't. So in order to ventilate something, you need an access. You need a point where you put the fan in, and then you need to understand where you're going to push the gases to. And we had no way of being able to do that in a meaningful way without potentially making the situation worse for people inside the tower.
Right. At what point did you abandon the PPV use?
I'm not sure what time was. I don't think I ever really thought it was a feasible option. It was just a case of getting it on the road in case there was a means by which we could use it.
Right. Now I'm going to get back to this question of stay put, if I may. I've got a number of questions about it, but as a more general question, can you tell us, first of all, whether you've ever had any training or experience of revoking stay put?
No, I haven't.
Right. There's no training and no experience as far as you're personally concerned.
No.
Do you know whether in the Brigade there was, as at the 14th of June 2017, any training on how to go about revoking stay put?
Not that I was aware of.
No. And could you tell us, and maybe you can't, but could you tell us from your own experience what factors you as an incident commander would take into account on the incident ground as to whether or not stay put should be revoked?
Absolutely. So the factors I would look at would be the feasible means of being able to evacuate people safely from a premises, the reasons why you would see fit to remove people who appear to be in a safe environment into potentially risk environment, the ability to be able to contact those people, the numbers of firefighters if it's a physical evacuation that you need in place to do that, the impact that if you change that then you took people away from potentially FSGs or fighting a fire, the impact that would have on the operational incident. There'd be a huge range of factors you'd need to take into consideration before you made that decision, bearing in mind that all of our building construction, all of our high-rise firefighting is predicated on the stay put.
When you evaluated as monitoring officer Andy Rowe's decisions, did you yourself familiarise yourself with the factors that Andy Rowe had taken into account in deciding to revoke the stay put?
No, I didn't.
Is there a reason for that?
Yes, because the decision had been made and my priority was to work out how we were going to get the people who were trapped in the building out.
Right. And would this be right, that the effect of revoking the stay put, which had happened only just before you arrived, meant that the building was now going to be fuller, perhaps, in the stairways of people trying to get out than was otherwise the case before?
Indeed.
And that would present a particular tactical challenge, would it?
Yes, a massive one.
Right. And were you able to assess whether or not, in fact, it was better for them to stay in their flats rather than present that tactical challenge, or did you not
From
consider
what I could see of the building at that time, I wouldn't have wanted anyone to try and remain in there.
Right. Now, were you aware of how the changed advice, or the change in advice, if you like, to get out... I'm sorry, let me ask a prior question, in fact. Andy Rowe had changed the advice, and let's just go to the Rowe log if we can. And his advice is recorded there at 2:47, if we can just have it up, as advise people to make efforts to leave the building. Is that how you understood the decision to have been made?
I think Andy briefed me that I think his words were something along the lines of, you've seen what's happening, you've seen the fire, we just now need to try and tell people to get out if they can.
Right, so you now understood that the advice was, is this right, that they should get out if they can?
Indeed.
Okay. And do you know how that new advice to get out if you can was communicated to residents?
Well, the only way of communicating that would have been if they were on the phone to control.
Right. What about residents who had been on the phone to control, told before the change to stay put in their flats, but didn't call back? How would they be told that the advice had changed and they should now leave?
The only way would be if we physically got firefighters up the flat to knock on their floors, on their doors. There's no other way of doing that. Control were not in a position in any way, shape or form to start scrolling through incident logs, trying to find mobile numbers and phone people back, because the volume of calls they were still receiving and the fire survival guidance as the priority, absolutely rightly, was what they were dealing with.
Are you aware, as Joe Smith told us, of a custom and practice in the control room of not calling callers back unless they're cut off?
Absolutely.
Right. Even on mobile phones?
Indeed.
Did it cross your mind that that custom and practice should be departed from in this particular incident, so that those people who had previously been given stay put advice should now be called back and be told, it's changed, get out if you can?
No, because I was fully aware that all the staff in the control room were engaged with fire survival guidance calls, and they were clearly our priorities, because these were people telling us they were trapped in their flats by fire and smoke. So at that point they become the priority, and we need to manage them first.
Does that mean that you didn't actually have a conversation with Andy Rowe about that?
No.
Right. Were you briefed by Andy Rowe as to when and how the decision to change the advice to get out if you can was communicated to the Bridgehead?
No, he just told me the decision had been made.
Right. Did you find out as to how and when that change in advice was communicated to the Bridgehead?
No, I knew it had taken place before I arrived. That's all I knew.
I see. So you, during your first visit to the tower, were you essentially assuming that those at the Bridgehead knew that the advice had changed?
Yes, and to be fair, it wouldn't have made any huge amounts of difference to their tactical plan, because their plan was still to respond to fire survival guidance. What they would maybe have anticipated seeing was large numbers of people come down the stairs, but that would only have been if the people had called back to control and been given that advice. So, you know, at that moment in time, I would expect the information to be passed to them, but I would absolutely expect their main focus was to carry on with the FSGs.
Did you investigate whether there was a need to communicate the change in advice to other control rooms and BT, who were taking calls from residents under fallback arrangements?
No, I was unaware that we were having other control rooms taking enough calls at that time.
I see. Nobody briefed you on that?
No, not at that moment in time. And fundamentally, that wouldn't have made any difference to our tactical plan on the fire ground. That was a situation that control and the duty DAC would be dealing with in control.
Were you aware that there are instances of other control rooms calling residents back and
No.
getting hold of them? You're not?
No.
In general terms, would you agree that there was nonetheless a need to keep other control rooms updated more generally, so that they could continue to give accurate and useful FSG advice to callers who got through to those control rooms?
If there were control operators available to do that, however, I think the main priority at that moment in time was continuing to answer and speak to fire survival guidance callers.
Are you aware, again more generally, of any training or system in place to facilitate the communication to other control rooms of a change in stay put advice, so that they could give up-to-date FSG advice?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Right. Are you aware that the Surrey control room, which was taking a fair number of calls, I think the total was 19, was only informed of the change in advice at 3:08?
I wasn't aware of any interaction with any other control room.
Right. Does it surprise you to learn that they were only told of the change in advice at 3:08, when the decision to change had been made at latest 2:47?
With the volume of calls that control were dealing with, no, that doesn't surprise me.
During this briefing we're talking about, and coming back to it at 3:39 or thereabouts, did you discuss with Andy Rowe whether you should assume command?
Yes, I did.
And what was the result of that discussion?
The result of that discussion was that I was very satisfied that Andy Rowe was conducting the role of incident commander in an appropriate manner, that he had a sound operational plan, and that I had no need whatsoever to take over from him. I was also aware, due to the scale and nature of the incident, that there were wider implications for London that I would need to be managing, such as speaking to the Mayor of London and various other issues that I knew I would have to pick up. Had I assumed control at that point and taken over, that would have tied me into that, and I would have been unable to fulfil the rest of my roles that I needed to do.
Right. Now, can I then turn to page 15 of your witness statement and look at the last paragraph on that page? You say there at the bottom of the page and over the page to page 16, you had a conversation with Andy Rowe and Matt Cook, and then you say the other senior officer in this role was Mick Mulholland, and then you say this at the top of 16. Their role is twofold. At a large-scale incident such as the fire at Grenfell Tower, one of the ORT officers follows the incident commander and conducts a quality assurance on what command decisions are being made, while the other ORT officer is out actually on the incident ground looking at policies, procedures and safety with regards to the actual firefighting. Do you know who carried out that quality assurance function on the night?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not aware. And actually, as I do say later on, that although those are the sort of laid down ways that ORT normally work on that night, because of the exceptional nature of the incident, they did work in slightly different ways and were involved in other situations as well. So they were working as a team and briefing as a team. I'm not sure whether they specifically individually had those roles on the night.
I see. Was it part of the monitoring officer's function to oversee or quality assure their role?
No, not at all.
Right. How different is their role from the monitoring officer's function?
Fundamentally very different. My role is specifically around the support of the incident commander and the role that they're undertaking. The ORT's is far wider because they're going out, looking at all of the sectors, looking at the incident that's happening on the operational ground. So they have a far wider remit and go into more detail. Mine is very specific around Andy.
Okay, so does that mean that they are the officers who carry out the assessment of the implementation of policies and procedures in the sectors?
Indeed.
I see. And they report back to the incident commander, do they?
So they can report back to the incident commander, or they would come and tell me, or the incident commander. So it's quite common they could give me a briefing if Andy's or the incident commander's busy at that moment in time.
Right. Okay. And would that assessment then inform the incident commander's decisions? Would you expect?
Yes, quite regularly.
And then you would then monitor those decisions in light of that information, would you?
In a sort of cold line drawing way, that wasn't what happened on the night due to exceptional circumstances, but that's the theory behind it. Yes.
Yeah. But in a cold line drawing way, would it work this way, that if in fact there'd been a departure from policy that the ORTs had picked up, they would report that to the IC, he would tell you about it, and then you would assess his performance in the light of that departure?
Yes, and they did regularly. They informed us of the numbers of departure policy, and I think they did it when Andy and I were together, so it wasn't a case of him telling me, it was a case of us receiving a briefing at the same time of a number of things we did that were completely outside of policy and quite extraordinary and exceptional.
Now, let me turn to a different topic, or different but related topic, which is the strategy and deployments at the Bridgehead. And first of all, I'd like to see if we can explore your understanding of what was actually happening at the Bridgehead. If you turn to page 13 of your statement, and go please to the last line of that statement up to the top of page 14, you say, and I think this is in your first visit, because you say I deliberately didn't go to the fourth floor at that moment, at the beginning of the paragraph. You say, however, on my understanding at that time was that the fourth floor Bridgehead, for which I think read third floor Bridgehead, were deploying resources throughout the building, predominantly tasked to search and rescue. The tasks were based on information that was being relayed to them by the FSG command unit. And I show you that. And then can I show you page 19? There are two bits of evidence we need to put together. Page 19, paragraph 2 on that page, where you say, the plan at that point, it's the second main paragraph, the plan at that point was to get as much EDBA into the building as possible in order to conduct search and rescue and to access those flats that we knew were involved in FSG. Now, we've talked about your first trip. After your fuller briefing with Andy Rowe, did you then go back to the Bridgehead and talk to the Bridgehead commanders about what they were doing?
Not for some time later, I don't believe. I believe it was a while later. The information I was getting was being relayed to me by Matt Cook and Mick Mulholland, who were giving me updates. Right.
So let's just break that down. So you hadn't done that in the period, your first trip into the tower, so just after 3 a.m. to about 3:20. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And you didn't do it, I think, in the next period, because you were on the command unit. Do you know, even roughly, when you went to the Bridgehead and had a conversation with Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne?
No, I have no idea of the time. I know that for a period of time I didn't go back to the tower, and one of the main reasons I didn't go back to the tower was on entering the tower, I believe on the first time, I had a very close miss of nearly being killed by a large piece of debris, and I didn't think it would facilitate running the incident terribly well if the Commissioner got killed on the fire ground, so I thought it was probably better for me to be remote from that while decisions were being relayed to me by other officers.
Right. Can you give us I know it's difficult, but can you give us even a vague time at which you did go to the Bridgehead?
No, I'm sorry, I can't.
Was it getting light, do you think?
I honestly have no idea. I'm sorry. If I could help you, I would, but I genuinely, this is part of my problem with memory recall. I'm sorry.
Okay. Do you remember a time when you were told about difficulties getting above the 15th floor?
I remember having that conversation. I remember having a conversation very specifically with Pat Goulbourne about the fact that he wanted to try and reach the 18th floor. And at that time we were unable, I think we weren't making progress past the 12th at that point. I have no idea what time that was, but he said the heat and smoke and the conditions on that above the 12th floor were so untenable that we were unable to get crews to access beyond that. And I'd also had a conversation in the intervening period with several BA crews outside of the tower who had relayed to me the conditions inside the tower.
Right, okay. Well, that was an attempt to see if we could put a time mark on when you spoke to them. We'll come back to that 18th floor, 12th floor point later. Can I just ask you this? Did you at any stage take any particular steps to ascertain how in detail the Bridgehead were deploying crews?
No.
Right. So does that mean that you never found out how the Bridgehead, or whether the Bridgehead was adopting a strategy of prioritisation of particular FSG calls?
I knew they were adopting a strategy because I had that information relayed to me by Matt or Mick, whoever was the one giving me the information. What I didn't do was physically go in there and look at what they were doing until later on. What did
Matt and Mick tell you about any system of prioritisation?
So they told me that the prioritisation was to get to the floors that were affected by fire survival guidance calls, that the calls were coming in from the FSG units, being relayed by runners predominantly to the fire ground. That information was being fed to the Bridgehead, who were then briefing crews to go up to the affected flats. So the priority was always to manage the people with fire survival guidance. I was unaware whether there was any prioritisation of the actual fire survival guidance calls themselves. At that moment in time, with the situation and the conditions inside the tower, in my view, every single human life in there was a priority.
Right. Okay. So does that mean, to cut a long story short, that although policy would require an IC to decide how to prioritise calls, in fact that policy was departed from?
I think it was departed from because of the nature and the volume of the calls, and we understood that people were moving around in flats, so it wouldn't necessarily have been helpful to do that. And for me, every single life in that tower was a life that needed saving.
Sure, but and within that, every single life, were you aware of any effort to sub-prioritise elderly people, children, or people with mobility issues?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Right. Did you think that that was something that should be prioritised?
At that moment in time, when you're faced with a tower that's on fire and you know people are calling for our help, you want to save everyone in there. I think it's quite difficult to make a judgment call on whose life is more valid.
Did you investigate whether, prior to your arrival, I understand what you're saying about what you saw, but did you undertake any investigation about whether prior to your arrival there had been a system of prioritisation?
No, I didn't.
Why is that?
Because at that moment in time, I just knew the scale and volume of the numbers of people involved, and the impetus was to get as many firefighters in there as possible to effect the rescues that we could.
Did you come to understand any system of collecting information about the success or failure of particular BA deployments?
I understood that as firefighters were exiting the tower, that information was being collected from them where possible. I also knew and saw for myself that some of the firefighters were exiting the tower were unable to speak and were in a situation of heat exhaustion and were collapsing, so we might not have got information from them. I saw some exceptionally firefighters under exceptional duress and strain.
Yes. Were you at any stage concerned about any difficulties in obtaining information about the success or failure of deployments, so that because failed deployments would mean that people were still in flats?
No, I understood that firefighters were going to the flat where they believed people were. Sometimes they weren't there, but then other times people were being deployed and encountering people on the stairs that needed rescuing and were priorities to them at that point.
Did you look to see whether there was a system of recording those kinds of deployments and their results?
No, I saw a lot of systems on the wall at the Bridgehead for marketing, but I didn't go into detail of that because there were sufficient senior officers managing that situation, and I had a far wider remit than that.
Right. Did Andy Rowe at any time give you his view that the building was lost, the priority was to rescue people and not stop the fire spread?
We had that conversation very early on. We were never going to stop the fire spreading, we were never going to put the fire out, and our priority was only ever to get to as many people as possible.
Right. Can you please go to page 22 of your statement, which has, in the second main paragraph, top paragraph, in the last two lines, something by you. You say, at this time, at Grenfell Tower, we continue to firefight offensively inside the building as we believe there to be savable life. Mm-hmm. Can you just assist me? Given that the building was lost and the priority was to rescue people and not stop the spread of the fire, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
How does that sit with you saying that you continue to firefight offensively? Can you just explain that?
Because the firefighting was necessary to try and subdue the fire at some of the lower floors to enable crews to proceed beyond that to get to the fire survival guidance, and equally for the crews that had gone above the fire to actually maintain a safe egress for them if they were bringing casualties out. So if we'd just done absolutely no firefighting whatsoever, then anyone who was in the building was never going to get any further, and quite potentially would have lost large numbers of firefighters who had been unable to make any rescues.
Right. Just continuing with the topic of this rescue strategy, you say, and I think we've discussed already today, that tactical decisions at the Bridgehead are not for the incident commander, they're for the sector commanders. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And is this right, that the Bridgehead makes the tactical decisions, the operations commander, who was Andy O'Loughlin, after Andrea took over, yeah, was responsible for those ultimately, and then the incident commander gets told about them?
Indeed.
Right. And your role as a monitoring officer vis-à-vis the incident commander's decisions, do you monitor the incident commander, or do you also monitor the operations commander as well to make sure that the incident commander is getting the right information?
No, my primary role is to monitor the incident commander and provide the support and guidance to him. I'm obviously aware of the information he's receiving. We'll have conversations around it, but I don't have a wider role of monitoring other officers on the fire ground, right, because my main focus, and especially on that night, my main focus was to support Andy.
Right. Did you talk to Andy O'Loughlin?
I believe I did. I don't recall what the conversations were about. I know I spoke to him on the night, but
right. Did you
not around detail.
You didn't have a detailed briefing with him?
No.
Right. Now, we discussed earlier any visit you made to CU7. First of all, do you remember when, or let's try it this way, how long after your arrival at the incident do you think you visited CU7?
I genuinely have no idea. That's one of the things. I recall opening the door. I recall seeing Tom Goodall. I recall seeing large numbers of information being written on the board. I recall an absolute sense of urgency and commitment, and it was a very dynamic and busy environment. What I would not seek to do at that point is to intrude on that environment, start asking difficult or awkward and detailed questions of them, because I knew they had already supplied that information both to the ORT officers and were supplying information to the Bridgehead. There are times and places where it isn't useful to ask for people to supply you detailed information when they're clearly very task-focused and very busy. Can I ask you to look at the IMP report on the incident, which we looked at earlier today? It's tab 30 of the documents bundle. And I'd ask you to look at page 3 of that, please. And this is the fourth item down, one of two. Control did not receive regular updates from the incident ground. Do you see that? It's being highlighted yes.
now. Control did not receive regular updates from the incident ground on the progress of dealing with fire survival FSG calls. However, the number of FSG calls being processed was unprecedented, therefore a review of PN 790 to deal with this. Do you agree with that? It says, therefore, a review to deal with this specific point is not deemed necessary. One of two is, unfortunately, that you can only put a certain amount of text into those boxes, so that is one sentence. Yes. So it's saying that it's not... yeah, I mean, we wouldn't review a process on that. The point I do agree with is that we need to ensure a two-way flow of information goes back to Control to inform them of the situation. OK. On the night, were you aware that Control was not receiving regular updates from the incident ground on the progress of FSG calls? You weren't? No, I wasn't aware of that. Is that something that, as a monitoring officer, you should have been aware of? No, absolutely not. That would have been the role of the Fire Survival Guidance Command Unit. To pass that information back to where that isn't something monitoring officer, that's a completely separate sector, so that would not fall within my remit, no. OK, just following the, as you call, the hard line, would that not be something that the FSG commander should have reported back to the operations commander? Obviously, he was the one who, the information wasn't coming from there, so he would not be aware that Control were, I think this came from Control, so we had Joanne at the debrief, so I don't think he was aware the information wasn't going there because it was Control who had the frustration with it. Right. OK. in this line of command, we're obviously looking at the incident ground. Where does the control room fit into that?
It doesn't really, fundamentally. That's that is the thing. The control room are sitting as a separate entity. They've got a Deputy Assistant Commissioner who is Adrian Fenton on the night, who goes in there to provide support and sort of strategic operational advice to them. And obviously they liaise directly with the Fire Survival Guidance Unit in relation to that, but they don't sit in the overall command structure of an operational incident on the fire ground.
No. And does that mean that any particular problems or changes in fire survival guidance which are dependent on feedback from the incident ground may not necessarily get fed back to the incident ground?
I think very much on the night that was the case, due to the extreme volume of calls, due to the two-way information, that the information wasn't being relayed back to them on that night.
No. And is one of the reasons for that the control room sits outside this information pyramid?
No, I don't think so, because on any normal operational incident, we're relaying information to and from control continuously. The problem that night was, of course, the fact that the vast majority of control officers were very heavily resourced dealing with fire survival guidance, and there were lots of pressing priorities. So normally control are in a two-way conversation with us on a command unit on a regular basis.
Okay, I think it would follow from that well, let me ask you this way. Did you review the arrangements for management of the FSG calls?
Absolutely not.
You say absolutely not, as if it's
not
something...
my role at that point in time.
Right.
So I'm not in a position to be making command decisions that are being taken by specific sector commanders. That would be completely inappropriate for me to do that.
Right. Now, you say, is this right, that you weren't aware on the night, even though you were reviewing Andy Ray's incident command decisions, you weren't aware on the night that the information loop was not being closed, so that results of deployments weren't going back to the control room?
No, because I'm not sure the fireground were aware of that, so Andy wouldn't have been aware either. So I can't review something that Andy doesn't know about either.
Was it not essential, though, in order for FSG calls to be responded to properly and for results of deployments then to be fed back, that information loop was closed so that control did get that information?
That would be the ideal, but normally when that policy is written, it's in response to us maybe dealing with 2, 3 or 4 fire survival guidance calls. When we're dealing with in excess of 100, trying to provide that information loop back, tying up further time, was obviously very difficult on the night. Obviously, it's ideal that everyone has as much information as possible.
Did you investigate how the incident commander, and indeed you, were kept abreast of developments regarding particular FSG calls or even in general?
So the FSG calls and the updates were obviously going through the Bridgehead. They had the information. That was not individual specific ones, but the whole concept of how that was working was being monitored by the ORT and by Andy O'Loughlin as the operations commander. Right.
In your capacity as monitoring officer, were you satisfied on the night that it was that the system of responding to FSG information was sufficient?
I was satisfied we were making every endeavour to commit operational crews into the tower to respond to those calls.
Right. Mr. Chairman, there may be an appropriate moment for another short break.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, do you envisage taking up most of the rest of the afternoon?
I am, yes.
Well, then this ought to be the time for break, I think. Yeah, we're going to have another short break now, Commissioner. Until 5 to 4, please, and no talking about your evidence when we're out of the room. All right? I'd like to go to the usher, that'll be fine. Thank you very much. All right, 5 to 4, please. Right, Commissioner, ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Millett.
Commissioner, thank you for coming back to us. Can I just ask you about your visit to CU7? First of all, how many trips to CU7, the FSG unit, do you think you made during the course of the night?
Potentially 2.
Right, potentially. I mean,
Yeah.
you say, does that you can't remember 2, or you may have made 2, or...
So I definitely recollect 1, and I think I went one other time, but I have no way of verifying that.
Right. Now, I know it's difficult.
Yeah.
Do you remember roughly how long after you arrived that you went to CU7?
No, I don't, unfortunately.
Okay. Do you know how long you spent in CU7?
Not long at all.
You said you put your head around the door.
Yeah, so the door was open, I conversed with them, I didn't step into their space and intrude on what they were doing, less than a minute.
What was the purpose of your going to CU7?
As much as anything, to support them, to give them some encouragement, because they were doing an incredibly difficult job, and just to let them know I was there, and to get a brief overview of what they were doing, but not a detailed one.
Right. In your role as monitoring officer, to tour the incident and evaluate what was happening, was it not important to you to have a bit more than a minute and actually investigate in greater detail what they were doing?
No, not at that time. They were so very busy. They were dealing with such a dynamic situation that an interruption of that would not have been beneficial for the supply of information from there up to the Bridgehead, which was my priority.
Right. Now, I've used the word tour the incident because I think that's the expression that's used in the policy, MO,
Yeah.
the monitoring officer policy 424, and it's paragraph 4.6, and I don't need it up, I'll just read it to you. The MO, having ascertained the IC's plan, intended tactics and communication structure, if appropriate, the MO should tour the incident and evaluate the operational plan and feedback to the IC. And in the light of that policy obligation, did you, as part of that tour, go to CU7 and evaluate its operations as part of the operational plan?
I evaluated it by speaking to them, but more importantly by speaking to Matt and Mick, who were doing that role. Any duplication of that by me going and asking further questions was an unnecessary interruption into their extremely important role at that time.
Right. So you evaluated what the FSG unit was doing, as it were, at second hand?
Yes, that's quite a regular practice to use the ORT officers. That's, they are doing that. They're another set of eyes and ears on the fireground.
Right. The obligation in the policy, though, is to tour the incident. And does that not mean that you would actually go to the different sector heads and actually talk to them about what they were doing?
No, the tour of the incident means for me to get the situational awareness, to go around the incident, see what's going on. It doesn't mean I have to drill into the level of detail with each sector commander as to what their role is or what they're doing. That's the role of the operations commander and the incident commander.
When you got to CU7, in order to evaluate the operational plan, would it not involve more than giving them support, but actually just finding out, even in broad terms, what they were doing?
I did find out in broad terms. That's the conversation I had with them, but enough of a brevity of conversation to not impact on the important role they were doing.
I follow. Who did you speak to?
Tom Goodall.
You spoke to. What did he tell you?
He told me how they were receiving calls. They still had. He had numbers on the board which I didn't write down or recollect. He told me how they were receiving the calls and they were using runners to relay the information to the Bridgehead.
Did he say anything to you about prioritisation of calls?
Not at that time, no.
Did you have a look inside the CU?
Briefly, yes.
Did you see a chart?
I did, but I didn't study it in detail.
Right, okay. Did you, even though you didn't study it in detail, did you observe that it had a system of prioritisation?
No,
in
I
it?
didn't.
You didn't. Now, we touched earlier on prioritisation at the Bridgehead. Did there come a time when you had a conversation about prioritisation with Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne?
No, the time when I had a relatively in-depth conversation with Pat Goulbourne was about, we had a conversation around the safety of the building. We had a conversation about how exceedingly difficult it was getting firefighters above, I believe, the 12th floor at that time. And the conversation we had was him saying, please don't make me stop committing firefighters to higher floors, which was never our intention. And he had an absolute pressing desire to keep trying to commit crews to the 18th floor. And I told him that I trust his judgment, we would carry on committing crews, but that I did believe that our firefighters were at severe risk at that time.
Right. And I think, in fact, you cover this. Let's just look at that now, if we may.
Yeah,
Page 27 of your statement. You, I think, cover this. Tell me if this is wrong. But in the second paragraph on that page, you say, at some point I had a conversation with Pat Goulbourne outside the tower about the structural integrity of the building. That's the conversation you're referring to now.
It is, yes.
Okay. And then you say he committed crews were doing work up to the 12th floor, couldn't get any further because of the heat and fire spread. He was very focused on trying to get to the 18th floor. And then you say, he had something in his mind, a piece of information. I didn't ask him the detail, but I suspect he had received from information about a family and or children. He was obsessed with trying to get to the 18th floor, but at that point, I knew we could not get beyond the 12th. Can you remember when you were told this? Was this on your first trip to the tower or later?
No, it wasn't. It was a subsequent trip.
Right. And you say that he was obsessed with trying to get to the 18th floor, but you knew, you say, you couldn't get beyond the 12th.
He was the one who told me we couldn't get beyond the 12th.
Right, I see, okay. And how did you think he was going to get to the 18th floor?
He just wanted to keep on with every ounce of determination, trying to commit crews to contain the fire and then commit crews to go beyond the fire to get up to the 18th.
I see, okay. Were you aware whether control was being informed either generally or even specifically, as per this example, of the decision not to commit crews above certain floors?
It wasn't a decision not to commit crews, it was an inability for crews to be able to proceed up beyond there. So it wasn't someone said we're not going to do that, because there was the endeavour to do that. At that moment in time, it was physically impossible to get beyond the heat barrier on that floor.
All right. Were you aware, put the question slightly differently, just following up that, were you aware whether control was ever informed, either generally or specifically, about the inability to get above certain floors?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
We have some examples, inability around 425 to get above the 15th floor. Does that ring a bell with you?
No, it doesn't.
Or 11th floor at 445?
No, I don't know specific times and floors, I'm sorry.
Were you informed at any point of the adoption of a strategy at the Bridgehead of a floor-by-floor, bottom-up deployment?
I was aware there was conversation around trying to do a floor-by-floor clearing process, yes.
What was your view of starting on the lower floors, given the number of fire survival guidance calls which were coming from higher up in the building?
I was aware that we were still trying to get to the higher floors. We were unable to get that. So in the meantime, trying to clear lower floors was an eminently sensible thing to do, because there may well have been savable lives on those floors.
At what point did you appreciate the importance of deploying EDBA crews to rescue residents from the higher floors?
Very early on.
Straight away?
Yeah, straight away. It was very clear that due to the intense fire and the heat and the nature of that the SDBA was being used up very quickly, and EDBA would be the only means of accessing the top floors. And
if you go to page 21 of your statement, I think we can pick that exact point up, Commissioner. You say that it's probably better to pick it up at the foot of page 20 so we have the full context. In the third line up from the bottom, you say, we don't as a rule rewear EDBA because it's a longer physical duration of time to be under air. However, because of the exceptional circumstances of the fire at Grenfell Tower, and because we don't have as much EDBA as we do SDBA, the question was asked whether firefighters could rewear EDBA. I believe this question came from Pat Goulbourne, who was in charge at the Bridgehead and committing EDBA into the building. He came in basically saying, we need more EDBA, can we get more? Now, before that request was made, had you discussed with Andy Rowe whether there was a sufficient number of EDBA crews at the incident?
Hand on heart, there would never have been a sufficient number due to the requirement we had. What I knew was that we'd ordered a large number of fire rescue units, which are obviously our frontline appliances that carry EDBA. So I knew we'd order those, but I knew that we would need to maximise the amount of EDBA we had in the fire ground.
Right, so this wasn't a calculated decision, is it? Was it just we just need as many as we can get here?
Indeed.
Were you dependent on updates from the operations commander or the Bridgehead in deciding whether there was a sufficient number of EDBA crews?
No, the request came in while I was on the command unit. I believe Andy Rowe was on the fire ground at the time. The request came in to say, can we get all of the EDBA in the fire brigade, which I authorised and had the message sent via mobilising control. And at the same time, in the meantime, can we rewear EDBA? And I made a command decision on the command unit to allow that to happen.
And we can see this, I think, in the Rowe log. But before we go there, in your witness statement, page 21, which we're still on, in the third paragraph down, you say that by this time, roughly around 3:45, is that the time that the decision was made to order all the EDBA in the brigade? I
would have to refer back to the either the Rowe log or the short incident report for that. Right, I don't have it in my head, sorry.
That's okay. Did you get that from the Rowe log, do you think?
I would think so, yes. Okay, it wouldn't be a time I'd remember off the top of my head.
Let's look at that then. If you go to the Rowe log, which is MET quadruple 05404, and go to page 2. We have at 3:39, which I think is the time when you come back to CU8 just after your trip to the tower, your brief trip to the tower.
That's correct.
And the phone calls you've made. We can see Pat Goulburn in fire sector carried out tactical withdrawal, and then in the next sentence, make-up for EDBA requested from PG. Were you on the CU when he made that request?
I was, and I actually believe that the time when the decision was sent from the command unit, I was definitely on the command unit. I'm not sure if Andy was still there at that time.
Right. I think Andy then left. In fact,
did.
He told us yesterday. Yeah. And he left you essentially in command on the command unit.
He did, yes.
So you did take partial command.
I do, yes.
Yeah. And then at 3:58, commission a command decision that EDBA can be reworn. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
All EDBA and Brigade to be ordered to the incident. So is that about the time, do you think, that that order was made?
I would think so, yes.
Right. Now, you can see, as I've shown you, that there had been a request for EDBA, or make-up for EDBA at 3:39. It may not be terribly long, but can you explain the gap between that question being raised by Pat Goulburn in the situation rep and discussion at 3:39 or after 3:39, and the actual command decision being made at 3:58?
No, I'm not sure.
How many additional EDBA wearers were in fact brought to the tower as a result of your command decision to summon all the EDBA wearers in the brigade?
So the command decision wouldn't have brought any further EDBA wearers. It would have brought further physical EDBA resources from the store at our protective equipment group and various other places. So it wasn't a physical people, it was physical BA sets that were coming to the incident ground.
Right. And is that more FRUs or just...
No, they would come on I think they came on a van from the protective equipment group.
Right. And ask the question again, how many, leaving aside the question, the wearers, how many EDBA kits were brought to the tower as a result of your command decision?
I have no idea.
Was it enough?
My view would be it would never be enough. I don't know. It was sufficient. They used them all. It was as many as we had.
Was there a reason why you didn't, or maybe you did you consider requesting additional EDBA kits from surrounding
I did, yes.
fire and rescue services? Who did you?
We had a conversation around it, but there is an issue, of the fact that a lot of other fire and rescue services don't have EDBA, and if they do, it's in very limited numbers, getting the resources there, and then there's issues around compatibility of breathing apparatus sets. They're not all the same throughout the country, but at that time, to actually physically get any large numbers from another fire and rescue service, I had no idea who would have those resources. But we did have a conversation about, I had a conversation which was recorded about speaking to external fire and rescue services, which went in, I believe, to Adrian Fenton.
Right, and do you know whether there was a conversation with those external FRSs?
I have no idea.
You don't. Now, we looked a moment ago, we'll go back to it, the decision to re-wear. That, I think, if you go to 3:58, that looks like that was the time you made that decision, command decision.
I think so.
Are you able to help us? Were you being asked retrospectively to approve a practice which was already in use? In other words, there was already re-wearing in use, or was this forward-looking to approve what hadn't yet happened?
I believed that they were requesting permission to do so. I wasn't aware whether they'd already undertaken that.
Okay. And do you know whether the request for rewears was made because of a shortage of EDBA on the ground at the time?
I would imagine so. That would be the circumstance you'd asked to rewear.
But did you explore? Because this was a departure from policy. Did you not want to know why a departure from policy was justified?
Well, I assumed they needed more EDBA wearers at that moment in time. Otherwise, they wouldn't have asked for a rewear. I wouldn't have needed to explore. Pat Goulburn's an extremely experienced officer who is an EDBA wearer himself. So by asking for that, it would have meant he needed that resource at that time.
Right, you didn't explore further with him?
I wouldn't need to.
Even though, in fact, you were, on that decision, acting IC?
Indeed.
Now, were you aware of earlier requests for additional BA equipment?
What sort of BA equipment, sorry?
Well, let's start with standard. Were you aware of earlier requests for make-ups of SDBA?
Well, the make-ups would have come on the 40 fire engines that came. That's
Right.
how our SDBA arrives on the fire engines.
Do you know whether extra EDBA cylinders were ordered first, and the call for all EDBA wearers was made later?
I'm not aware of the sequence of that event, sorry.
Okay. Do you know whether there were enough firefighters at the incident who were actually trained in the use of EDBA?
We had all our operational firefighters who were trained because we had all our fire and rescue units there, therefore all of our EDBA capability, and there may well have been other support pumps where there were EDBA trained firefighters on those.
Was the rewear motivated or driven by the absence or deficiency of numbers of EDBA trained wearers, or was it kit?
It would have been kit.
Kit, right. Is there any reason why all LFB firefighters shouldn't be EDBA trained?
Yes, there is at this moment in time. EDBA training is a very arduous, very physically demanding role. It's a circumstance we wouldn't use for normal firefighting because it puts extra physiological demand on the body, and there's been lots of studies into recognising those demands, so we wouldn't seek for everybody to have those facilities to use that. It's specialist kit that we normally use for longer travel distances. We don't use it for extreme duration firefighting, shall we say.
Would it have helped on the night if EDBA had been part of the predetermined attendance, at least in some numbers?
It would have been, because it came on the fire rescue units, which are part of predetermined attendance on make-ups.
For the initial predetermined attendance for a high-rise?
No, for a high-rise, they're not on initial predetermined attendance. No, you'd have had to have a number of fire rescue units on that predetermined attendance, because one fire rescue unit would only give you one EDBA crew, because you then have to have the second one as a safety crew.
Yes. So would it have helped on the night to have had a requisite number of FRUs as part of the predetermined attendance?
Potentially, but you have to bear that against the risk of the number of calls we get to high-rises that would mean the additional driving across London of our fire rescue units and the risk that poses to the public of additional 999 blue light journeys. I think that with time we ask them to get them there, it's a meaningful time. One of the things we are looking at as a result of this, as part of our replacement breathing apparatus, is new technologies to see whether or not there are sets that give us an extended duration that aren't necessarily as arduous as EDBA. So that's something we'll always look at, new equipment and new resources as it becomes available with new technology. And part of that new technology means there are potentially lighter breathing apparatus cylinders. That means that the wear and tear on the firefighter's body is not as great.
We turn to a different topic. FSG recording on the wall in the tower. Did you observe that for yourself?
I saw it as an overall snapshot view of it. I did not take details down.
Right. What was your impression of its use?
That we had no option other than to write it on the walls due to the volume of it.
Right. Did you observe the extent to which officers working in that sector were able to obtain the results of rescues and then inscribe them?
No, I didn't.
Now, Andy Rowe said yesterday, when I suggested it to him, that the post-Lacanal policy for capturing rescue information in the forward information board, which is captured by policy 820 post-Lacanal, had been tested to destruction and found wanting on the night. Would you agree with that assessment? Completely.
The unprecedented nature of the incident at Grenfell Tower demonstrated that although we'd made considerable recommendations since Lacanal and taken those up, the events of that night were way over and beyond that.
Radio communications. Can you remember what command channel was it you used?
No, I can't.
Right. Would you have expected a dedicated command channel to be set up at the time of arrival?
Potentially, if it was working, or if they were unable to get command radio channel traffic or radio traffic through.
We've had some evidence about difficulties in setting up channel 2 as the command channel. Were you aware on the night that was a common problem?
I was aware that a radio engineer had been ordered to the fireground because of problems with communications.
Thank you. But were you aware on the night that it was a common problem that had been the subject of previous experience?
I know we sometimes have issues with radio communications.
Right. Were you aware of any steps to try to resolve this ongoing problem on the night?
That was why we ordered the radio engineers to the fireground.
And did they turn up?
I believe so.
Did they help?
I don't think so.
Why is that? Do you know?
I don't know.
Did you... We've also had some evidence about the airwave command channel that was later set up. Did you use that?
I gave my airwave radio to, I believe it was Peter Johnson on the command unit, as his need was greater than mine to be able to have communication.
And do you know why the airwave radio command channel system wasn't set up at an earlier stage?
It's not something we use as standard practice, and also airwave radios aren't carried by every single firefighter, they're only issued to officers.
Was it a problem on the night that the command units don't have or didn't have airwave channels, which meant that you had to lend yours?
It made the communication much easier once I did, yes.
Right. So can we put that down as a problem on the night?
I think it was a problem on the night, and I think that it's something that was assisted by me, surrounding my airwave radio.
Once you'd lent your personal airwave radio to the CU8 crew, how did you monitor the command channel, or did you not?
No, well, at the times I had Matt or Mick with me who had their airwave radios on.
Right.
So the information, I could hear that through that.
Right. So, was it very satisfactory that you, there, as monitoring officer, were actually dependent on other people's radios?
Not ideal, but the more pressing need was for the command unit to have my radio.
That I understand.
And I spent a lot of my time on the command unit, so I was physically able to monitor what was going on.
Andy Rowe also told us yesterday that the airwave radios ought to be used on the incident ground, notwithstanding any security concerns.
Sorry,
Well, Andy Rowe told us yesterday that one of the problems was that senior officers leave their airwave radios in the car on incident grounds and are dependent on fireground radio. And he, I think, agreed or certainly offered the evidence that airwave radios should be used on the incident ground, notwithstanding any security concerns that surround their use.
I agree with that.
You agree with that?
I do, yes.
Did you ever become aware of communication problems between the Bridgehead and those outside the tower, whether in the command unit or elsewhere on the incident ground?
Yes, I was aware of the communication problems. That's why we were using runners.
Right. Would it be normal to use runners?
Quite often we use runners. It ensures the information is guaranteed to be relayed. And if the radio channels are very busy, what it ensures is a reliable flow of information.
It seems like a rather primitive system to have individual firefighters running around the incident ground with pieces of paper. Was there no better system you could have deployed on the night?
No, that was the most effective system.
Right. And would airwave radios, if used between the command unit and the Bridgehead, have assisted in resolving or mitigating the communication difficulties that were experienced?
Potentially, if we had sufficient airwave radios on the fireground at that time.
Now, Richard Welch suggested that the overall effect of the lack of communication, or difficulties in communication, was that the Bridgehead commanders were making decisions without strategic direction from the incident commander. Certainly at the early stages of the incident. Would he be correct in that assessment?
I don't know, I wasn't there at that moment in time, but I would suspect, and to be fair, both Pat and Richard are very experienced fireground officers, therefore if they were making decisions at that moment in time, it would have been right and proper for them to do so.
Yeah. Were you aware of particular communications within the building itself?
I was aware we had problems communicating with firefighters who had been committed into the building, and that resulted in us having situations where we class it as firefighting emergency, where we had lost communication.
Many of the firefighters who were deployed into the building under breathing apparatus who had a Barry set complained that the Barrys weren't very efficient. Is that something you know about or knew about?
Yes, it is, and we're in the process of replacing our BA mobile communications.
You are you?
Indeed.
Okay. And on the night, did you have a brigade awareness of the inefficiencies in the use of those Barry sets?
It was already an ongoing project to look at replacing them. The technology we had was what was available at the time we purchased it. Thankfully, technology's moved on and you've now got the ability to have wireless communication rather than having something that's got a cable tied to it. Right.
CSS failure. The IMP report classifies the CSS as having failed on the night, and we've had some evidence about that. I'm not sure it's necessarily important to go back to it. You say in your statement, and it's page 10, I'll show you, page 10 in paragraph 2, you say it's the third line down, we're in the process of replacing the electronic one because it's not always reliable. And it went down at 4:03 hours on the night. And I think that's a reference to the row log.
Indeed, that's correct.
Were you there when it went down?
I can't recollect. It's a regular occurrence that CSS fails.
Do you recollect it ever been up? Was it operational?
No, to be honest with you, I was mainly looking at the whiteboard that had the information written on it.
Right. Now, you say it's not always reliable. Isn't that something of an understatement, given the evidence that we've heard in this inquiry?
It's definitely not always reliable. It's not something I, as an incident commander or monitoring officer, rely on. It's the practice that we back it up with information written on the whiteboard, which is what I tend to use. We've got an actual printed encapsulated sheet where we write all the information on that's stuck onto one of the boards on the command unit.
I mean, looking at it on the night, was it really acceptable that a modern brigade should be reliant on the use of pens and whiteboards and have outdated equipment that wasn't reliable?
I find the pens and whiteboards are extremely efficient and effective and do the job we need them to do.
Right.
We are in the process of replacing it. It's not an effective system.
Yes. Andy Rowe was suitably impolite about the CSS. Would you agree with him?
Indeed, I would.
Right. Water. You say on page 18 of your statement, if I can just take you to that, that night we had water issues, second paragraph. And you explained the difficulties, and you say a water officer role was assigned to address these issues. Mm-hmm. Was that Gareth Cook?
I have no idea who was assigned that role.
Oh, I see. Do you remember any briefings from him, whoever it was, the water officer, to the incident commander yourself?
No, I have no recollection of that.
Right.
I was just made aware of the fact that the hose was compromised on a number of occasions by falling debris.
Right. Would it have helped to have had a specialist water expert advising the incident commander on various options to deploy when these difficulties were experienced?
We did have one, I believe. We had a bulk media advisor who was ordered to the incident, but it would have made no difference whatsoever. There was never going to be enough water to tackle the fire. It wouldn't have made any difference, whoever we had on the fire ground, to deal with that.
And is that not just because of the puncturing of various hoses because of falling debris, but the layout of the building and the dry riser in the building?
That and the fact that you need 2 firefighting jets per floor, and when you've got a building that's completely alight, there's never going to be enough water to supply 40 firefighting jets.
Even with Thames water on full pressure?
No, not even with Thames water on maximum pressure.
Right.
We're lucky on a normal high-rise building to get 2 to 3 jets.
Gas. Was there a time when you became aware of the involvement of gas in this fire?
I believe I was aware of it.
And did you think that a representative of Cadent, who were the suppliers, be invited to the tactical coordination meetings?
They would have been as part of that group. I wasn't particularly aware of them being there.
Were you involved in any of that?
I don't believe so.
And were you involved in any decisions to shut off the gas supply?
No, I wasn't.
Right. 42-metre ladder from Surrey. We had some evidence from Andy Rowe about that yesterday. Andy Rowe said that London does not have a 42-metre ladder, and he was surprised that Surrey did.
Yeah, I'm quite surprised that Surrey did, but obviously they had a replacement project on their aerial appliance that enabled them to buy some of the new technology and have an extended height ladder.
Well, I was going to ask you, why did Surrey have one and London not?
We're in the process of equally replacing our turntable ladders at the moment. Part of the issue around it is the fact that London's streets are a lot narrower. London's bridges have weight loadings on them. 42-metre aerial appliances up until now have been extremely heavy and had wide chassis and haven't been appropriate for use in London.
Now, the Surrey aerial appliance arrived, I think, at about 19 minutes past 8 a.m. Could steps have been taken more promptly, do you think, to secure its attendance at an earlier time in the incident?
It could have done, but it wouldn't have made any difference getting it there earlier because we already had our own aerial appliances that we'd had to take away from the building because they were catching fire. So having a taller aerial platform there earlier on would have made no difference. In fact, we used it very satisfactorily for the dangerous structure engineer to be able to have a closer assessment of the building later on. But as a result of using it earlier in response to firefighting or rescue, it would have been impossible.
Could you just give me one moment, please, Commissioner? Yes, Commissioner, you'll be glad to know I've come to the end of my questions. I do have one final question. We've discussed during the course of your evidence today quite a lot about what the Brigade is now doing. Would you be willing to come back and assist us, if necessary, by giving further evidence in settling any questions about urgent interim recommendations which the Chairman might think was necessary?
Of course I will. I'll be happy to help in any way I can.
That's very helpful. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask you to rise now in the usual way, just to check my notes, to make sure I've
Yes,
not
of
missed
course.
anything.
Yeah, well, it sometimes happens, Commissioner. In fact, I could say it almost invariably happens that there are one or two additional questions that need to be asked. So we'll break now until 25 to 5. I'm sorry we're going to overrun our usual deadline, but not by much, I hope. And then when you get back, we'll see if there are more questions.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. I'd like to go with the usher. Thank you. Right, 25 to 5 then. Right, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Millett will now tell us whether there are any further questions.
There are one or two, I think probably five, to be fair, further questions. So, Commissioner, I'm grateful for your patience.
Thank you.
The first is this. When you first arrived at the incident ground and you did your tour, what was your understanding of the plan at the Bridgehead to rescue people on higher floors in the building? For example, the 18th floor, which you referred to earlier.
Yes, I wasn't aware of the specifics of the detail of any floors in that plan at the time.
What was your understanding of the plan to rescue people on higher floors in particular, though?
No, my understanding was just that the Bridgehead was committing breathing apparatus crews in response to fire survival guidance calls.
Right, so does that mean that your understanding was that they were just getting where they could?
No, I understood that they were just committing them. I don't understand what the system was at that time on my first tour.
Okay. Now, the inquiry has seen transcripts of calls to the control room where people had told the control room operator that they were trapped or where there were smoke in their apartments and were told to stay put. Do you think that was the right advice?
So the normal advice, if you are saying that there is fire within your compartment where you are, is if you can leave, to make efforts to leave. That's what people are. That's what the fire survival guidance note says. That if you're talking about there being something actually impacting where you are, you should be told where you can and where possible to make efforts to leave.
And would you expect the control room officer to go through some detailed questions and answers with the caller to help the caller ascertain whether or not it was safe to leave in those circumstances?
Yes, I would expect them to answer a range of questions about whether there was a means by which they could leave, whether there was another exit, whether they could get out onto the stairs, those type of questions.
Now, knowing what you now know, do you think that the stay put advice should have been revoked at an earlier stage?
No, as I mentioned earlier on, I think that it would be very difficult for me to make any judgment on what the officers at that time could see and the information they had. But I also am very fully aware that from very early on they were dealing with multiple fire survival guidance calls. Those people clearly had to be our priority, and that by asking people who were in unaffected areas to take up valuable space in the stairs at that moment in time would not have necessarily benefited anyone in there.
Are there any particular lessons that you've learned from your experience of the night that would enable the decision to revoke the stay put to be taken earlier?
No, I don't think so. There's nothing in particular. I think that the officers on the night acted with all the information they had in the best interests of the people at that time.
Which brings me to my final question, similar to the one I asked Andy Rowe yesterday, Commissioner. If there was one aspect of the London Fire Brigade's response to the fire that you could go back and change, what would it be?
I wouldn't change anything we did on the night. I think, without exception, my firefighters, my officers and my control staff performed in a fantastic way given the incredible circumstances they were faced against. They were put into an untenable situation in a building that behaved in a way it should never have done, that put the residents' lives at risk, and without a shadow of a doubt, I personally was responsible for committing my firefighters to their potential death in the pursuit of rescuing as many people in that building as possible.
Commissioner, thank you very much. I just want to express my gratitude to you for coming here and answering my questions today and assisting us with our investigations. Thank you.
Yes, and I'd add my thanks to those of Mr. Millett. We're grateful to you not only for coming here to give your evidence, which is obviously very important, but also for making available so many of your officers to come and give evidence to the inquiry at times that may have suited our schedules, but I suspect didn't suit yours at all. So thank you for that too.
Thank you, sir.
Right, well, thank you very much. I'd like to go with the usher. You're free to go.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, I do have about 5 minutes of housekeeping, if I can call it that, which I just want to raise with you and with those present.
Right.
I want to look ahead for a moment, if I may, to the next tranche of oral evidence, which with the inquiry will be receiving. At the procedural hearing in December last year, the inquiry invited the bereaved survivors and residents of BSRs to submit witness statements to the inquiry. We have received some 265 BSR statements, and the inquiry would like to express its gratitude to each individual who has felt able to make such a statement. It cannot have been easy, and we must not underestimate the value of this written evidence to us. Those statements have been prepared specifically for the inquiry, with the assistance of experienced legal representatives who are known personally to the witness in each case. And those preparing the statements have tried as far as they can to ensure that the statement covers all factual matters relevant to Phase 1 comprehensively. We've seen that. And often witnesses have felt able also to address matters which will arise for consideration in Phase 2. The result of that is that the inquiry now has a significant body of evidence from the bereaved survivors and residents, which makes a very significant contribution to our understanding of the developing conditions within the tower on the night of the fire. Turning to the oral evidence then, the inquiry has considered all the witness statements. On Wednesday next week, the 3rd of October, we will begin to hear oral evidence from the first of a number of the survivors of the fire. That evidence will continue through to early November, and that's an estimate that we make. The witnesses whom we have asked to give oral evidence, Mr. Chairman, at this stage are those who appear likely to have the greatest insight into the conditions in the tower on the night, and particularly in relation to a number of specific matters, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. But as we proceed with the oral record, the written statements of those witnesses not called will be put into the record. There's no question about that. I want to just make sure that everybody understands that. I'd also like to make it clear that in deciding who to call, the inquiry has not been influenced by any considerations as to what an appropriate number of BSR witnesses should be, and equally has not been influenced by considerations about the timetable. Nor are those who have been asked to attend being asked to come along and just read their statements. The question of whether to ask somebody to come and give oral evidence has followed a review of that person's individual account in respect of those matters which the oral evidence will seek to address. And those are, number one, early decisions to self-evacuate. Two, the entry of the fire into the flat 6 at different floors, following that number up the building. Third, the conditions in the lobbies and stairwell, particularly between 1:20 a.m. and 2:47 a.m., when, as we now know, the stay-put advice was at latest revoked. Fourth, events on floor 14, which I know is very important to some BSRs, and certainly very important to us as the inquiry, to looking at the matter in the round. Fifth, evidence of good conditions at the very highest floors in the tower. And sixth and finally, evidence from residents trapped on different floors, but who shared the common experience of being trapped in the tower for a prolonged period of time and after the stay-put policy had been abandoned. Lastly, on oral evidence, questions are going to be limited to Phase 1 issues. That means that no decision has been made as to oral evidence for Phase 2. It remains possible that those who are not giving evidence for Phase 1 in the next few weeks could be invited to give oral evidence in Phase 2, and the same applies to those who are giving oral evidence as well. Against that background, Mr. Chairman, can I turn to the question of the timetable for the next few weeks? Our initial list of those to be called was issued with the caveat, the warning, that there would be additional witnesses. We also invited written representations from core participants, and we've responded to those representations. We have invited a number of further witnesses to give oral evidence, and we're awaiting clarification of the position of some of those witnesses from their respective legal representatives. Once responses are received by us from them, we can then issue an updated list of those to be called to give oral evidence, and I can only urge the legal representatives concerned to try to progress matters as quickly as possible and to consult with the inquiry team if concerns arise. The inquiry will sit, subject to you, of course, Mr. Chairman, Monday to Thursday, starting at 10 a.m. each day in the usual way, subject to any applications from the advocates to sit earlier. And the evidence from the BSRs will be heard from the 3rd to the 18th of October to start with. Feedback from individual legal representatives and prospective witnesses is that were the inquiry to sit in the week of the 22nd of October, half-term week, then that could cause difficulties, not only to those asked to give evidence, but also to those who wish to attend the hearings, we want to make absolutely sure that all our witnesses are able to give the best evidence they can with the minimum of distraction and interference in their domestic lives. And the inquiry will therefore not sit in that week, or we would invite you to direct that the inquiry would not sit in that week, but to resume hearing evidence on the 29th of October. The inquiry will then use the break in the evidence to continue to ensure that appropriate support is put in place for the witnesses that are yet to come, and that will include progressing the programme of familiarisation visits which have been offered to witnesses so far and will of course continue to be offered. On the question of support, as I think, Mr. Chairman, you know, the view of the inquiry team is always that witnesses are best supported where we can engage in dialogue with the witness or their legal representatives. We've provided witnesses and their legal representatives with a written briefing which details the support that's available before, during and after the giving of oral evidence. The package already in place includes familiarisation visits that I've mentioned, which are proving very useful in explaining the work of the inquiry and the hearing process. It includes our safeguarding, as best we can, the privacy for those witnesses who want it. And finally, for the sake of clarity, the support available has always meant that no witness has given evidence, having given evidence, is limited to using public transport to return home. Taxis will be available where needed. Now, the schedule for next week's witnesses will be disclosed tomorrow. I have already said that so far as the last firefighter witnesses are concerned, those will be taken on Tuesday, and they will be, in no particular order, Mr. O'Neill, Mr. Ricketts, and Mr. Davis. But subject to that, Mr. Chairman, that is what I wanted to say about the future further progress of the evidence in this phase.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to endorse everything you've said, and it would probably help everyone if I were to make it clear here and now that the inquiry will not sit during the week of the 22nd of October, and if that assists people in making arrangements for family matters or any other matters, well, so much the better. But there it is. We shan't sit for that week. We shall break now and resume on Tuesday, that's the 2nd of October, to complete the evidence of the firefighters, and look forward to hearing the first of the bereaved survivors and residents' witnesses on Wednesday.
I'm grateful.
Yes, good. Thank you very much.